The premiers of Alberta and Ontario agreed Monday to a feasibility study of new pipelines and rail lines between provinces and pledged to increase interprovincial trade of alcohol and vehicles. To talk about this and more is our political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist, Brian Lilley. Now, Brian, you called it an outbreak of common sense in Calgary when Alberta's Danielle Smith and Ontario's Doug Ford met at the McDougall Centre in downtown Calgary and signed agreements to work together. Now, they also had words for Prime Minister Mark Carney. What was your takeaway?
Just that common sense prevailing, them talking about the need to build pipelines. I think at one point, Premier Smith has been talking about a pipeline to the West Coast, and she'd like one to the east. And then Doug Ford steps in and says, I want pipelines going north, south, east, and west. The idea that the Alberta provincial fleet, they'll try and buy trucks made in Ontario when they're procuring trucks. And that's a great idea. They're solid trucks. It's either the Silverado built in Oshawa or the F-150 out of Oakville from Ford. These are good things and ideas that, premiers should be doing when we're facing trade uncertainty and all of that. But, they did have those words for Prime Minister Mark Carney, the idea that, hey, you're saying nice words right now, but we will need to see action at some point. Interview that Premier Ford did with my Sun colleague Rick Bell in Calgary. He said, I'm giving them I'll paraphrase here, but Ford essentially said, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt now, but I'll be an 800-pound gorilla on them if we don't see action down the road.
Right, because what's the point of pipelines if there's still an emissions cap, which is essentially a production cap? Now, you were in Calgary for a few days. I was also there over the weekend to cover Stampede, as well as the Premier's Pancake Breakfast held yesterday. Now, speaking of Danielle Smith, we even see from your social media that you met up with her. And so I'm wondering, what did she have to tell you?
It was good to see her again. It's been, well, I guess I'd seen her a few months ago in Ottawa, but before that, a long time. And we're both in our best Western outfits. Yes, I put on a cowboy hat
Nice.
to go to Stampede. I got some flack about wearing Bluntstones and not cowboy boots, but I live in Toronto. I'm not going to go whole hog there. But yeah, we just she, like so many people, just wants the political gossip, and so it was private conversation. I won't go too much into it, but like everyone else, wanting to know what's going on, trade a little bit of information here and there, trying to figure out who's making the next move. So very sharp premier that you have in Alberta.
Right, and I just recall Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi calling the Stampede a political petting zoo, which was kind of an amusing comment from him.
Considering that he wants to be premier next and he will have to go, and that he's the former mayor of Calgary, that's an odd statement. But Naheed Nenshi is, I don't have to tell you, he's an odd politician. He's one of the thinnest-skinned politicians I've ever covered, and I've covered them straight across, well, most of the country from Nova Scotia all the way out to British Columbia. Thinnest skinned guy I've ever talked to.
Wow. Now, Federal Finance Minister Francois-Philippe Champagne has sent a letter to every cabinet minister telling them to find cuts. What kind of cuts are we talking about here?
Tens of billions of dollars.
Wow.
So this is to program spending. This is what they're saying anyway. There's statutory spending, then there's program spending. There's different ways that they label the amount of money that they take from us and then allocate across the country. So this would be core programs. They're being told find 7.5% savings this year, going up to 15% over the next couple of years. That's significant. You can, organization, if they're told, look, we have to tighten the belt, find 5% savings, yeah, you might notice it a little bit, but most organizations, most companies can find 5% savings. Finding 7.5 this year and going up to 15, that could be significant. You could really end up noticing. Now, some of this, we're being told, is because the government has pledged new money for defense, but also, this is a federal government that has let spending get out of control under Justin Trudeau. So Mark Carney's mantra during the election campaign was he wants to invest more and spend less. But I can tell you, Nav, if if this was a conservative government doing this, if this was Pierre Poilievre, if he had won the election and said, "Oh, we're going to start cutting 7.5% of program spending this year," uh, I think that there would be outrage and horror. The press gallery would have a very different reaction than the one that they're giving to Mark Carney, promising to cut deeper, some say, than Jean Chrétien did back in the 90s.
Well, yeah, and I was going to ask you, like, do you find it odd that a liberal government is looking for ways to reduce government spending, yeah, especially after 8 years of a tax and spend government?
Well, if they follow through with it, it'll be going back to the Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, John Manley ways. Those
Hmm.
were liberals who understood that you need to balance the budget at some point. When Stephen Harper was in power as conservative prime minister and tried to get back to balance after the financial crisis, of course, the liberals decried every attempt to cut spending, even temporary program spending that they brought in to deal with the fiscal downturn in 2008, 2009. The liberals would complain if you stopped spending on that. And then they got into power and, of course, showed that they weren't the same liberals. Maybe this is a return to that. John Manley used to tell me he wasn't cutting spending, he was moving it from low priorities to high priorities. It's a different way of looking at it. But look, this needs to be done, but 7.5 to 15%, as I said, that's a cut you're going to notice.
Now, still on the topic of cuts, do you think any of these cuts may impact things like healthcare?
It's tough to see how they wouldn't. Or, of course, healthcare spending by the federal government is a transfer to the provinces. Now, there is a dedicated health fund that goes to the provinces, and then there's a separate one for a dedicated social services fund, education funds, things like that. In the 90s, when Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien balanced the budget as a team, they did it by cutting transfers to the provinces. That's why premiers like Ralph Klein and Mike Harris had to cut in healthcare because that's the biggest line item in any provincial government's budget. And if you're getting less money, you've got to cut somewhere. And those cuts to the healthcare systems across the province were painful for years, and some would say the reverberation still being felt. So I'm not sure how they don't or other programming, but the government is saying that the cuts will not hit healthcare, they will not hit dental care or pharmacare or the other child care, the other programs, which by the way are all provincial. They're all provincial jurisdiction that the Trudeau government decided, hey, let's spend more money and invade provincial jurisdictions. But they're saying they won't cut those. Well, what else do you have? Are you going to cut defense? No, you've promised to increase that. Are you just going to cut bureaucracy? Well, that's grown dramatically, but you know, uh, the bureaucrats do help run some programs or fund programs. It's unclear how they'll get to that. It's a hefty promise, but one that will be tough to deliver on.
Now, when we're talking about line items on the budget, I mean, we should probably talk about the interest we pay on our national debt. And I think last I heard it was about like around $150 million a day, if I'm not mistaken. Would any of these cuts go towards bringing our debt down?
Well, I mean, you have to hope so because we now spend more servicing the debt each year, not lowering it. This is like just paying the minimum payment on your credit card bill. The balance doesn't go down. You're just paying the interest. Uh, it's over 50 billion a year. We now spend more servicing the debt than the federal government does in transferring healthcare dollars to the provinces.
Wow.
Much more than we spend on the military. I think it's about close to double what we currently spend on the military.
Wow.
That's not a sustainable way. I mean, we're not quite as bad as the Americans, but they also have a bigger, much more dynamic economy than we have, and our governments are struggling in part because of the threat from the Americans. They sneeze, we catch a cold. So yeah, we do need to get that in order. Um, you know, Hopefully Mark Carney does. Yes, you have to hope the best for the country.
Now, you have a front page story today on a CBC journalist who quit and took some parting shots at the broadcaster on the way out the door. Brian, this sounds juicy. Tell us more.
Yeah, this is Travis Danraj, originally from Calgary, worked at CBC in Edmonton and elsewhere before moving east to Toronto. He covered Queen's Park, our provincial legislature, for Global and CTV, and then CBC recruited him. and they put him in the top spots. He was covering Parliament Hill for them. He was on Marketplace. And then they said, we want you to have your own 2-hour primetime show, and we're going to call it Canada Tonight with Travis Danraj. Well, it launched in January 2024 and quickly started running into problems. And Danraj says there is a lack of diversity at CBC. Now, he is a self-described brown guy whose parents immigrated from Trinidad. And the way he would tell you the story is they thought they were getting one thing. Then they found out that he wanted diversity of opinion, and that's the kind of diversity that CBC doesn't want. They're happy with diversity as long as it's only skin tone deep. He was trying to put on, I was on this show a couple of times. He would put on far left New Democrats. He'd put on conservatives. He'd put on liberals. He'd put on people that don't fit into neat, tiny boxes. And they did not like that. He accuses CBC of having a very definite political bias, of being dysfunctional, of not living up to what the state broadcaster should be. And yeah, he really torched them on the way out the door. But in a funny twist, just before sitting down to talk with you, Nav, the lawyer for Mr. Danraj sent me a message saying CBC has said he's still an employee.
What?
And she said, no, he resigned. And they said, we have to decide whether his resignation is valid. And she said, well, too bad. He's gone. So they're still saying he's an employee, but they did shut down his email shortly after he sent a long all-staff email encouraging people to help reform CBC and not let it continue to decline.
We need to keep covering this and following this story, Brian. Now, switching topics, though, the by-election has been called in Battle River Crowfoot for August. Now, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is facing some challengers. Is this a guaranteed win for him, or is there a chance that someone else could take it?
I highly doubt that someone else would take it. Look, the organized parties, I don't think the Liberals are going to put up a fight in this one. They're going to run it the way that parties used to run by-elections for leaders, let them win. The NDP says they'll put up a fight, but they're broke. They've got no money, and they have no hope in that part of Alberta, not at the federal level. So, he will apparently face the longest ballot committee again. Those are the people that put 200 names on the ballot in Carleton, where he ran and lost in the general election. Look, he's already been out in the riding working it. He opened his office in Camrose last week. He was just chatting to him earlier today. He said he's doing a quick stop in BC. Then he's back in, I think he said he's going to Three Hills. It is a massive riding geographically, and he's going to work hard to win it, other than things where he has to pop out for, this trip to BC, as I said, or going to Stampede, kind of a necessary, even if Naheed Nenshi calls it a political petting zoo, it's a necessary thing for party leaders to do. I think he's in good shape for winning this.
Now, you mentioned the longest ballot committee, and this is the group that convinced dozens of people to run as independents in Poilievre's Carleton riding in the last federal election. Do you think we will see this happen again in this by-election?
I hope not, and I hope that Elections Canada changes the rules, or Parliament changes the rules. There's one guy that goes around and recruits everyone. And why? Because he has some vision that I can't quite understand of the need for electoral reform. And this is how he's going to convince people to into doing it, by annoying them to death. We don't need 200 names on a ballot. One of the names on the ballot in Carleton in the general election was a part-time teacher here in Toronto who gave an interview to the Toronto Star saying, no, I've never been there and I have no plans on going. Well, why's your name on the ballot then? You're just causing mischief. There's a few tweaks that could be made that could see this put to an end. But, hopefully either Elections Canada has the power or MPs give them the power. This isn't how you bring about electoral reform.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.